This is Duke University.
And we're going to begin with Dr. Sandy Darity, who is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, and Economics, and the Director of the Duke Consortium on Social Equity at Duke. He served previously as a chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and it is giving us an incredible pleasure and privilege to have him joining us. So please join me in welcoming him.
So I just mentioned, is Karen Jean still here? No, I guess not. Okay. I mentioned to her that she will have heard much of this before because she serves as the librarian for the African and African American Studies Department. There's Karen Jean. And she takes the conscientious, she makes the conscientious effort to attend all the classes. And so as a consequence, some of the work that you're going to be hearing about today is stuff that I've talked about in those classes. But I hope there's something here that will surprise you, Karen G. So let's see. I want to talk about the question of who owns the narratives of Malcolm X and Nat Turner. These are the bad black men. There are representations of them, a vast number of representations, both in works that are ostensibly historical and ostensibly fictional. I'm going to muddy those two bodies of work in the context of this particular talk. I was doing work on Nat Turner in 2010, 2011 or so, when I was asked to review Manning Maribels' book on Malcolm X. I felt incapable of reviewing that book, but because the biographical and scholarly literature on Malcolm was far, far beyond what I had already covered. And in the process of looking at Nat Turner, I had a sense that I couldn't really take on both projects simultaneously and write a timely review. But subsequently, I began to think about comparisons between the two and the ways in which they've been presented or their images have been displayed in literature, primarily American literature. I also had a sense that's important to think about the element of the mystical in both of their lives. I'm thinking about the fact that the signal that Nat Turner took finally to conduct his revolt in Virginia was a blue sun that appeared over the Cross Keys. In the context of Malcolm's life, the entire theological story of the creation of whites by the actions of Yaqub have kind of a mystical dimension to them. And for those of you who might have read Kevin Baker's novel Strivers Row, set in New York City circa the time of the 1943 riots, Malcolm in New York City actually meets Elijah Muhammad in a dream. This is long before he actually meets Elijah Muhammad while he's incarcerated. The starting point I want to use today is the fact that each of these men have supposedly told their own stories. They both have autobiographical documents, but of course those autobiographical documents have been written by somebody else. So the relevant autobiographical document for Malcolm X is Alex Haley's work. And in the case of Nat Turner, the lawyer Thomas Gray purportedly reports on a verbatim conversation that he had with Turner while Turner is waiting to be executed. And this is what we now know as the Confession of Nat Turner. Both Malcolm's and Turner's stories have resulted in Pulitzer Prize-winning works. So Maribels' biography of Malcolm X received the Pulitzer Prize in History. Styron's novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner, received the Pulitzer Prize in Literature. And, you know, apart from the fact that there are some occasional novels that receive the Pulitzer Prize that I really like, it may be the case that that's a signal that there's something problematic with the works, but we'll come back to that. So if we start with Haley's autobiography as a positioning work in terms of the responses of other types of artists and writers, I would say that there's actually two sorts of reactions that have predominated. One is to actually fairly literally capture or absorb the story that is told in Haley's narrative. An example or illustration of this is Spike Lee's film Malcolm X, which I think fairly faithfully follows the chronology and the narrative that's told in Haley's autobiography. Another is Michael Eric Dyson's hip-hopization of Malcolm X. A third is Bernard Doctor's Malcolm X for Beginners. And then there's the occasional reaction that attempts to actually undercut the story or the narrative that's presented by Haley. And here I would give primacy to Keith Perry's book, which attempts to subvert the Haley narrative by, in effect, diminishing Malcolm. Contrary to the blurb on the cover of the book, it treats Malcolm as a persistent hustler throughout the entire course of his life. It even echoes the accusation that was made by the New York Police Department that when an explosion took place at his home, that he was the person who set the fire off himself. Okay, so but nonetheless, the Perry book is a reaction or a response to the Haley autobiography. In the case of Nat Turner, Gray's confession functions as the foundation for Styron's novel, which I think is primarily an expression of Styron's own neuroses. There was a tremendous reaction to that novel, both favorable and unfavorable, and I think one of the most significant is the underestimated 10 Black writers respond in an edited volume by John Henry Clark. As I said, I think this book is an expression of Styron's personal neuroses. It treats Nat Turner as a self-hating, fanatical madman who leads a revolt in part because he's unable to have a relationship with a white woman whom he desires. Styron, in the process, treats the confession itself as entirely authentic. Similarly, Kyle Baker, in a graphic novel, utilizes the confession as an authentic document as well, but he transforms the message of the document into a heroic portrayal of Nat Turner in a powerfully drawn set of images and pictures throughout the course of the novel. Perhaps more interesting, though, are the works that depart from reliance upon and or direct conversation with either Haley's autobiography or Turner's confession. These are works that go outside and beyond each of the anchoring documents that I've talked about. And I would situate Maribels' project in that context, that it's a document that attempts to utilize a wide range of materials that were not part of the construction of the autobiography. Now, it's interesting that this particular work has been attacked by those who focused on analyzing the assassination of Malcolm X and naming the assassins. And these are also writers who had not positioned themselves in the context of the Haley text. So I'm thinking in particular of Carl Evans's angry review of Maribels' reinvention of Malcolm X. Evans was the author of The Judas Factor and also a superb biography of Elijah Muhammad, the messenger. Similarly, Zach Kondo, in the same year that Evans published The Judas Factor, published a volume called The Plot to Kill Malcolm X, and he was similarly dissatisfied with Maribels' biography. And then finally, Louis Lomax wrote To Kill a Black Man. Unfortunately, Lomax's premature death, under somewhat mysterious circumstances, leads us to not have had the opportunity to have Lomax provide us with an assessment of Maribels' work. But I think it was in part because of the complexity of the stories of the assassination and the process of naming the assassins that I was reluctant to write a review myself, because I just felt like I wasn't able to unpackage who had the best position on the story. I think that Evans and Kondo in particular, though, were disturbed because they felt that they had told the story themselves, and little attention was given to the work that they had done in Maribels' work. And then there's an online video where A. Peter Bailey repudiates Maribels' novel, as he would put it, even though it's not a novel. And he's particularly exercised by Maribels' speculation that Malcolm had a phase in life where he engaged in homosexual sex. Now, coincidentally, in Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, Turner also is portrayed in having an episode of homosexual sex. In fact, it's the only sexual liaison Styron's Turner has in the entire novel. We do know that there's evidence that Styron bypasses some critical information about Turner in terms of Turner's personal life. There's no evidence of a wife. There's no evidence of children in Styron's Confessions, even though apparently Turner had both a wife and children. So again, I think more interesting are the works that depart from responding or reacting directly to the confession. Most interesting, I think, is Sharon Ewell Foster's new pair of novels. And they're called The Resurrection of Nat Turner. And I presume it's a resurrection from William Styron. But this is a particularly interesting set of novels because the main source of information for Foster is F. Roy Johnston's The Nat Turner Story. Johnston was a lay historian who self-published a volume that was based upon oral histories that he gathered in Southampton County. These oral histories essentially constitute the folklore that's shared by the residents of the county where the revolt took place and the kinds of information that they profess to have about Nat Turner. And the other example of a work that departs from the Confessions, and it long predates Styron's Confessions, but it doesn't make much use of Thomas Gray's confession, is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. Now, the conceit of Sharon Ewell Foster's novel is that she tells a story about Harriet Beecher Stowe gathering information to write her novel Beyond Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Foster has Stowe meet with Will, one of Turner's revolutionaries who actually escapes to the north. I mean, that's the conceit of the story. It's a very, very interesting idea. So as a consequence, Stowe, who is initially prepared to write a novel that's entirely condemnatory of Turner, recreates him as the character Dread and actually portrays him as a very sympathetic figure in the anti-slavery cause. Now, the other thing I'd like to say about both of these men is that the narratives that we have about them characterize them as having redemptive moments within a prophetic tradition. Now, in the case of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam redeems him from criminality and perdition. Now, of course, there's a certain duality to his experiences in the Nation of Islam. On the one hand, the nation provides dignity, pride, discipline, and a spirit of black nationalism. On the other hand, there is a troublesome theology concerning the origins of racial difference and race. There was a degree of intolerance that was associated with a condition where any departure from the desires and teachings of Elijah Muhammad had to be corrected. And the variant of black nationalism that's practiced by the nation has a kind of element of what we might call right-wing ideology that actually is not very far removed, I would argue, from Clarence Thomas's version of black nationalism. Now, the irony, of course, is that Malcolm was an individual who did not eschew the use of violence, but in his own life there's actually no evidence that he ever engaged in any violent acts towards anyone who was white. There is some evidence that he did attempt to direct violence at other blacks who were functioning as infiltrators into the nation. But there's no evidence that he directed any violence against whites, and that in general, his own life was not a life that was absorbed with violent activity. It's just he never ruled out the option. On the other hand, Turner obviously did. So the second form of redemption in the context of Malcolm X's life is a redemption from the philosophy of separatism and right-leaning black nationalism that's achieved by his embrace, and this is problematic in and of itself, but he uses this language, true Islam. Okay, so of course we now have, in this very moment, a high degree of contestation over what constitutes true Islam. This may, in some degree, have been foreshadowed by the kind of journey that Malcolm X took himself. In the context of Nat Turner, Sharon Ewell Foster's novel, I think, really functions as an attempted speculative historical work. And the way in which redemption occurs in that novel is somewhat different. So Foster parallels the Nat Turner story with the story of Jonah in the Bible. Again, Nat Turner himself was referred to as Old Prophet Nat. He was a biblical teacher and was deeply absorbed with the Old Testament in particular. So in the story in the Bible, Jonah's charged with going to Nineveh to tell the people there that they've been living in sin. And he continuously avoids this task, but finally, after he is spit ashore live by a giant fish, he ultimately goes to Nineveh and fulfills the responsibility that he's been given by God. Turner also has strong moments of hesitation. He tells the whites of Cross Keys that they are living in sin by maintaining slavery. They whip him until he is close to death in the novel. This is not what the people of Nineveh did. If you recall the story of Nineveh, the king of Nineveh says, yes, we have sinned. He puts himself in sackcloth and ashes. He tells all of his citizens to do the same, and they go into a period in which they seek atonement. Okay? But Turner is whipped into submission. And subsequently, his task, because he has been assigned this task by the God of the Old Testament, is to engage in an act of revolt, since the whites would not voluntarily end slavery. Okay? Well, he hesitates to take action. So his redemption is embodied in the moment in which he ultimately does lead the revolt, even though the immediate after effects are vicious repression and killings of blacks, whether or not they were actually part of the uprising. On the other hand, we could argue that there's a redemptive dimension to this because it's the beginning of the Civil War. Okay? So in the context of the Turner story, we have the question of what constitutes true Christianity. Is it the Christianity of the Old Testament or of the New Testament? Clearly, Nat Turner's retributive mission is built into thinking about the God of the Old Testament. Correspondingly, in the context of Malcolm X's life, we have the issue of what constitutes true Islam. And indeed, Malcolm was very, very interested in trying to address the question of the necessity of the use of violence, either as a matter of self-defense or for the purposes of liberation, in contrast with white terror campaigns, which are devoted to the use of violence for repression. But there is a paradox here that I'll close with. And the paradox is associated with another claim about what constitutes the true meaning of Islam. Near the end of his life, Malcolm X was riding with Charles 37X Kenyatta. And there's an incident that occurred where it became apparent that the person who was driving the car was driving them into an abandoned stockyard area. And so their lives were clearly in danger. And the way in which they are saved is Charles, 37 Excagnata, has a gun on himself. He's carrying one, and he turns it on the driver and gets the driver out of the car. And then they race to the airport, and Malcolm goes on the trip that he was scheduled to do. But Charles says that Malcolm tells him in the aftermath of this assassination attempt that was foiled by Charles's possession of a gun, Muslims don't carry guns. So I'll stop there.